good evening and welcome to the first live stream of the week. So first of all, thank you very much for turning up here to be with us this evening. As always, I appreciate your time here. So hello to the gang. I can see Ozzy, Chris, Mr. Joe Cool, John. So first of all, so as you join, I'll do my usual preamble. So suffice to say that whilst we're here to do the talking, you're here to do a few things as well. You've got to work for your time here. So if you're watching this on Facebook, share it and like it. If you're watching it on YouTube, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new live streams, because occasionally I just go and do them whenever I take the notion. So just be aware of that. And also make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, because those naughty people over on YouTube just occasionally unsubscribe people. I have no idea why. Obviously, all my other social media links are down below, so you can find me on all the other platforms, blah, 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 blah. Just make sure you do follow me in all of them. Again, you never know when the moment of censorship comes. If you like what you're saying or what you're hearing tonight, give us a thumbs up. The algorithms like the thumbs up, so give the thumbs up. And if you don't like what we're saying, don't say anything. Finally, there's altnewsmedia.net/donate to go and drop a few pounds in the hat. Or if you are Chris Davis, hit the super chat. And just on that, so I think those are all the preambles. We're going to talk, Chris, about Trump being back, because, you know, Rebecca and I talk about the topics we're going to cover each week. And, you know, there's lots of things always happen in the news cycle. But I watched the Trump speech at CPAC last night, and I thought it's worth talking about, because it's going to dominate the political world, I think, in the next, number of years, perhaps. So we're going to talk about that. I think that's about it, really. But we're going to talk about something else, because, you know, again, in fact, actually, can we drum roll, bring her on? I see her just having a pre-show drink. Anyway, Rebecca Butler joins the stream. Hello, good evening, Rebecca.
Hi, David. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you again. I see we're coming in from Hawaii with Dawny Girls, so nice to see you all, and thank you for having me, David, as usual.
It's always a pleasure, Rebecca, trust me. In fact, Rebecca, you know, as we were just saying there, we do talk about the topics and whatnot. And sometimes it's almost like we live in a world it's only a COVID world. And yes, COVID's really important. And you and I, you know, talk about it quite a bit. We debate each other on it. But sometimes I think it's nice really not to talk about COVID, just occasionally. Because there is other stuff going on in the world. And I did watch the Trump speech at CPAC last night, and I do think that does have global political significance. And I want to chat about that. But the other thing that we mustn't forget about, Rebecca, is that, you know, there is a world still going on out there, regardless of whatever strains of COVID are around and hospital infections and all that. There's still a world of stuff going on out there, and our economy lies at the heart of it. So that's my way of saying, on Wednesday, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is going to stand up and give the budget speech. And I don't know about you, but sometimes you think, would I like to be in his shoes or not? Now, I'm sure he wears extremely well-polished shoes, and he's a very adept speaker, and I think he's a pretty impressive personality. But let's talk about the job that confronts him on Wednesday, and what, you know, where do you think he's going to come from? Because I've got loads of slides I want to put up, but let's just start off with what do you think the Chancellor will do, or what do you think he should do?
Well, what I think he will do and what I think he should do are actually two different things. I think he's a very adept politician. I think he's a very adept Chancellor. I think the nice thing about Rishi Sunak is he's not, a prince of darkness like George Osborne was. I think he's powerful than Sajid Javid, who I was a bit disappointed with him as a Chancellor, even though it was a very brief tenure. Yeah. So I do think he is a very, very competent, safe pair of hands. Don't see the snake-like political behavior from him. I think he knows that it will be a coronation when Boris's day is done, and he will just sit in the sidelines waiting for that day. He's very much under Downing Street because of the restructuring that happened that led to Sajid Javid saying he wouldn't take the role because basically their offices merged. And Number 10 really took responsibility for the messaging coming out of the of Number 11. But in terms of what I think he'll do, I am worried that he might attack businesses. I'm very concerned he might do that. It does worry me, but I hope that if he does tax businesses, the ones that he goes for are Amazon, Facebook, Starbucks, people like that who are big and don't pay enough in tax as it is. Now, you and I on this show have talked about Amazon taxes before, and I think absolutely everybody would recognize that via Amazon, China manages to import tariff-free into the UK. And those tariffs ought to be paid. There's also a VAT issue. So there's a massive tax evasion that goes on through that gig economy. And I really do hope that Amazon tax gets paid. Now, if that's just a set transaction fee, or I would hate to see people paying more because a tariff was applied, but I wouldn't hate to see people, say, spending £1 per transaction, or Amazon having to pay £1 per transaction, because that's not going to affect the buyer particularly. And I think, Rishi knows that there is actually a huge amount of money stored up in people's bank accounts. It's not earning money on their interest. So there is a lot of money waiting to be released. There is a bit of a floodgate waiting. It's going to go on holidays, staycations, big parties, weddings, stuff like that. So I would really hope that he doesn't tax those sectors, because that would be wrong and that would have a stifling effect. I would hope that he would cut business rates, but I think he's going to put up corporation tax. He may put capital gains tax up. So I see it being a bit of a little bit here, a little bit there. I also hope the stamp duty holiday is extended. I'd really like to see that, because that's been a huge success. And there are all sorts of things that they're talking about, like 95% mortgages for first-time buyers. That's really important, again, because there are loads of people with stored up deposits who need to get onto the housing market.
One of the things, Rebecca, is the media, as is always the way in advance of a budget, there's all kinds of headlines being pushed out there. Here's just a couple of things that I've read in the past few days. You may have seen them as well. If we can just flip a couple of these ones up. Yeah, so calls for Rishi to extend the furlough scheme in UK budget. I think that's a no-brainer. I think that's definitely going to be happening. So regardless of the enormous cost of the extension of furlough, again, Rebecca, you and I have talked about this a lot. And you got to, it's
about this, I have to say.
Pardon, Rebecca?
I do have some discomfort about this. It's a bit of a license, I think. But anyway. Yeah,
I agree. It's one of those ones whereby the government policy necessitates it in a way, but in another way, it's a really wasteful amount of our taxation. But there it is. But anyway, I think that's going to happen. We've got to bring up the next one, please. More Brits favour scrapping stamp duty. So that's, again, Brits wanting the income coming into the Treasury reduced. So good luck with that. But that might happen as well. Bring up the next one. Drum roll. There we go. Alistair Darling. There's a voice from the past, Rebecca. Alistair Darling. And this is one of those ones, Rebecca. And I was going to chat to you about this one actually last week, I think it was. So he says Labour is politics, obviously. But both Darling and I know Sir Keir has also said it would be very bad to raise taxes in general and taxes in business in particular. But Darling's he's kind of got a point, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. And of course, one thing that Alistair Darling and Rishi Sunak have in common is that they were both chancellors in a big crisis. So Alistair Darling had the subprime crisis and the crash of 2008. And Alistair Darling introduced us to quantitative easing from the Bank of England and the massive cut in interest rate. I've always thought that Alistair Darling was actually a competent and a credible voice from that Gordon Brown government. I would credit him with greater ability than Gordon Brown to be the job in hand. I actually quite admired Alistair Darling, and I did think he did steer a steady ship through that awful subprime banking crisis. So yes, I agree. And you know what? Please don't put us through austerity again. That would just be disastrous. I really don't want to see cuts in public spending. Really don't want to see that. I would like to see HS2 scrapped, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, but I would like to see public infrastructure spending. But I want to see just people being released from holding on to their money and releasing it back into the economy. For me, if you increase the level of benefits payable, you are simply sort of relocating the money back into the economy because it comes back in VAT receipts. So for every £100 you give somebody, you get 20 quid back on a VAT spend. So
well, but I mean, I see Jed's made the point there. He'd like to see IR 35, I think is the point. Stopped for the private sector. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, this was something that came up. It sort of reared its head because it was a policy that they had countenanced back a year ago, in fact. But because of the pandemic, they kind of put it on ice. But the IR 35, if anybody doesn't know, it really is, there's a huge group of people who tend to be very well paid. It's not all of them, but a lot of them tend to be very well paid, where they operate as a one-man limited company, and as such get massive tax breaks. And the idea is they ought to be saving for a rainy day. But equally, I think the narrative is right that if you're not contributing to the tax burden, which the rest of us are, then why should you get the benefits of all the other taxpayers? So why should a management consultant who calls themselves John Smith Limited, why should they get the same benefit when it all goes TU, as it has in the last year, as say the guys who work on my building site who pay tax? And, nobody asked for the pandemic, but you can't have the same take out of a tax system if you haven't got the same proportionate in. And it does, the demographic of people who the IR 35 will predominantly hit are that group of management consultants, interim CEOs, interim CFOs, all those kind of guys who are doing it for sneaky tax evasion and NI evasion. That's what it's all about.
I think, Jed makes a point as well. He didn't get any furlough and he was not allowed to claim. And Jed, you were by no means alone. I mean, that was, again, one of the bad things. But I wanted to, sometimes I want to be devil's advocate here. And if we can put up, I wanted to look at UK public sector net borrowing. And I've got a chart, like a bit of data, I like charts. If we could bring up the public sector net borrowing chart, that would be really good. Yes,
economics degree wasn't wasted, David.
That's such a long time ago, Rebecca. But yes, the point about this really is, this just simply demonstrates. You can see in this. You can see, Rebecca, you talked about the crisis we had back in 09, 10 and the banking crisis. And you can see what the effect that had. But let's pull back and look at that. Yeah, 2020. So that's and then the rest of it is forecast. And one thing I learned, Rebecca, over the years in economics, forecasts, one man's forecast is another man's just wild estimate. But there's no doubt about it. The UK, I think I'm right in saying, Rebecca, our borrowing is now back at levels last seen in 1697. So we shouldn't underestimate the challenge that the Treasury and the Chancellor faces, because if I was facing that, and that's staggering, absolutely staggering. And I think that the figures that flow from that forecast-wise, in my view, are a bit on the optimistic side. But even if they're not, it still means that the UK economy has been hit with a mega shunt, a mega jolt. And it's not obvious because we've got 6 million people in furlough. The economy's frozen. It's all being funded by the government's borrowing. But it's just not credible to sustain like that, is it?
Well, a little while ago, I asked a question on Twitter. And the question was, who do we owe the money to? Public sector borrowing. Because you don't. You don't actually owe that money to anybody. And I, of course, as you can imagine on Twitter, I got the usual, you're meant to be intelligent, you stupid woman, don't you understand? Well, actually, I do understand. And one of the question is really a rhetorical question, which is, it's government bonds, basically, that is what borrowing is. So you quantitatively ease, you put more cash into the circulation, and you borrow against the future value of your bonds. But every economy is in the same position. So we're not borrowing from the IMF. We're not borrowing from the World Bank. We're not borrowing in that way. We're borrowing against ourselves. We're hedging ourselves effectively.
We're hedging we're hedging our future, or in regards our economics future. Actually, we're not even. It doesn't really particularly affect us, but it affects Rebecca, being you and me and people like us. It will significantly impact our children and our grandchildren, perhaps, if unless things fall into balance, But
why? Because we got historically low interest rates. We need a little bit more inflation, although not at the moment, because we don't really want to skew the economy to give savers more money on their savings. We actually want them to spend their money. And as long as you have a vibrant economy where things are manufactured and things are sold and things are bought, then the actual number that you owe is irrelevant. Because, when I was born, when you were born, it wasn't a big deal that we were still paying the war debt back from the Second World War. We only stopped paying that back about 14 years ago. So pay back to who? This is a global problem. Therefore, there is a grand neutralizing effect apart from China, but a grand neutralizing effect on everybody. So my view is, please don't put us back into austerity. Please don't cut public services. Build council houses like crazy, because we can capture the rent back from the welfare payments. Build more, do more. Don't go back into austerity. The number, in my opinion, isn't really that much of a deal. But I'm not an economist. I'm just saying, who do we owe the money to?
Yeah, well, there's several answers to that, but you touched on a really interesting point. I just wanted to throw this one into the stream. I'm going to be streaming on Thursday night. I've got a special guest who is an expert in the issue on the area of housing, construction of housing in the UK housing stock, the problems that we face, and all of that. So tune in on Thursday night, please. It's going to be really interesting. Just focused on what Rebecca just mentioned there indirectly, the whole housing issue, which again, like so many issues, Rebecca, it was a really big issue up until COVID hit. And then like so many other issues, it's been kind of swept away a little bit. And but problems are still there, and we need to deal with those problems. And so we're going to be tackling that on Thursday night. So do make sure you join in that conversation at 8 o'clock. I wanted to actually, I'm going to just give you a second or two to key this one up, Rebecca, because I know there was a slide that you put up that you shared actually with me just a little bit earlier. And I think, again, I mean, these are different aspects of the economic overview. But if we just bring this one up now, maybe you can talk us through it, Rebecca. If it's in, yeah, I think that's it. Maybe we can zoom in a little bit, because it's unless you've got really good eyesight, maybe you all folks can all see it, but I can't. Anyway, Rebecca, over to you.
Yes, this is basically it's called 60-day delinquency rate. So this is people defaulting on loans. Now, the y-axis is percent and the x-axis is numbers. And then this is by month. Yes, so right. You can see that the delinquency rates on repayment of car leases and car loans has gone up quite steeply as a result of the pandemic. And then you'll see all of them to a greater or lesser extent. Just bear in mind that the y-axis does change in its scale as we're going down these. But it's a measure of repayment of debt. So cars, credit cards, mortgages, and other unsecured debts. So unsecured against your properties, that is. And this was sent to me by my son, who is also an economist. And he said, you know, look, this sort of was looking at this today.
Yeah.
And what it really talks about is it's young people. It's the, you know, younger than middle-aged. They can't default on rentals or mortgages. Absolutely not. So other things have to go first. But it's mounting debt on an age demographic that already has a significant debt when they come out of university because of their student debt. Yeah. So by very virtue of the fact that they've got that debt profile of cars, credit cards, so on and so forth, by virtue of that means they are also paying off their student debt. And so it's stacking this interminable problem of lockdown on the younger generation, and the generation that needs the most help. It's an impossible situation how to give them help if you are also looking at massive national debt where inflation's got to go up, for example. So
that's right. Yeah.
Their clothes are going to cost more, so their ability to pay their debt is going to go down because their sort of activities of daily life are going to have to be funded out of a wage packet. And if inflation, if we remain in a deflationary economy, then their savings aren't going to be worth anything. So this is a really big problem that is like the hidden story here is what delinquency rates are going up. I dread to think, because we're only at the beginning, I dread to think what those delinquency rates will look like this time next year, because as I've always said, this is the start of the problem. We're not at the end or even the end of the beginning here. This is
I agree, Rebecca. I think so much of the damage that's been caused to the economy and to just people generally, it's kind of invisible. It's certainly not emerged. It's emerging in those sort of figures that you just shared with us. You can see some of the issues emerging there. But the other thing is that I actually think, for example, whilst the furlough scheme has done a job at a massive price, fundamentally there are sectors of the economy and businesses and companies, and they're not coming back. I mean, we just need to be honest about that. I don't believe some of them will come back unless we can get, Rebecca, to lockdown completely ended and all the social distancing and all the rest of it ended. And I don't see that happening. Do you? Not in the next 3, 6 months?
No, I don't. But it's really interesting because a comment has just come up on the stream from Joe. Hyperinflation is almost inevitable, and this is a real worry. We've already seen the beginnings of hyperinflation. Anybody who went out to a restaurant or a pub in summer last year will have seen that pub food prices skyrocketed. I mean, whereas before you would go out and think, sitting in a pub having, scampi and chips, you'd think, well, that's £7.50, maybe £8 for a basket meal. It's now £15. What would have cost you £25, including a bottle of wine, £25 a head? You're now paying £35 or £40 a head for a basket of scampi and chips and a starter and a bottle of rubbish red wine. Hyperinflation, once the economy opens up again, that which remains, because competition has fallen and because there's greed built into the system, they want last year's profits to be recovered now. Hyperinflation will happen. They've got to find a way to stop that, and I do dread Joe, that was a really good point to make, that it's inevitable that there will be hyperinflation. It's to what extent we can control it that's important.
Well, actually, Rebecca, you mentioned the fact that, food prices went up during the summer of 2020. If anyone has been buying from restaurants, although you can't go in and eat, you can buy like carryouts from restaurants. And I know family who have bought those like a meal for two from like a decent restaurant, but the prices are really, really high. And I understand why they're really high. I mean, I understand what the restaurants are doing, Rebecca, but in a sense, they're building into their pricing structure the fact that essentially they've been closed for so many months, they've got no profits. And so I think, it's almost a banker that prices will spiral upwards. The other thing is I don't want to sort of wrap this one up pretty quickly, but on corporation tax, it seems really likely that corporation tax is going to go from 19% at the moment up to, well, they're saying over a couple of years, 25%. I would completely oppose that because I think it would damage British business, especially in the post-Brexit era when we're trying to become a global, economic power again. But I think the Chancellor may be tempted to go down the CT route. I would rather he did it selectively, as you pointed out, and go after particular sectors and leave other sectors alone. Most particularly British small business, leave it alone. Leave the hairdressers, the self-employed, the plumbers, leave those guys alone. Do not go after their little companies, or I don't mean to disparage them, but they're smaller businesses, and go after Amazon. Amazon's destroying the high street anyway. There again, if you go after Amazon, and I know this, Amazon will simply add the cost of the tax onto their seller base. So I'm not sure, I'm not sure who wins in that. But
no. But one thing, that again has come up in the stream is a really, really important metric of how global economies are doing is the price of oil. Now it had a staggering volatility because it was about this time last year, or maybe in March, end of March, it was in negative numbers because, of course, the Saudi states are controlling the supply of oil. Now, they have flooded the market with billions of barrels of the stuff.
Yeah.
And the price plummeted. But now, I don't know if you follow oil, but, because my son is an oil guy. Yeah. It's $60-odd a barrel now. It's hugely expensive. So you know what? Put a hedge on it, because it's got to go down. It's got to go down to like 50, 52. But one final word. I know you want to move on. Yeah. What I would love to see in this budget, and I know this is a heresy, not for your stream, but certainly for the Conservatives, I would really like to see Rishi Sunak say Theresa May's legacy legislation, which was a complete disaster, which was her carbon neutral 2050 pledge, push that back to 2060, because we cannot afford that. We cannot afford a reduction in fuel duty revenues. Where are they going to replace those in a post-pandemic world where we've already lost fuel revenue? So I'd like to see the fuel customs duty cut, or at least stay stable. And then what is the plan for when it's electric? How are you going to recover that lost revenue, which is customs duty on fuel sales?
Yeah.
We can't cope with all of these things now. So push Theresa May's ridiculous legislation back. I'd see it pushed back into, 2200, but that's never going to happen. But
yeah, although I think there's a certain lady in number 10 Downing Street, very close to the Prime Minister, who does, I think, have a real thing about the green agenda, the low carbon agenda, all of this, which, in these kind of pandemic times, economically speaking, you just got to think, you got to wonder, I mean, is there any economic logic to it? Anyway, but nonetheless, we have, I think we got to the end of the first section there. There's loads Rebecca. We should probably do a separate stream actually on the whole sort of zero carbon narrative and how it would work in the country and how it wouldn't work, what it means for people, all that kind of stuff. Because, it worries me enormously, because it's like, it's just not thought. There's no common sense applied to it anyway. Anyway, we're going to wrap up this section, and we're going to, in a second or two, move on to talk about the guy who's dominated the global political narrative for the last year, Donald Trump. But before we get to that, just a reminder that, as I say, super chats are enabled on the stream. So if you want to get your comment dealt with by Rebecca and myself, do make sure you hit the super chat button.